Hello, world. Patricia O'Connor and Frida Reba Dorsey here, and tonight on the Bonsai balcony, we are live at Frida's place. I uh, if I am reading all of my instruments correctly, it looks like we've got sound going. I've got my microphone going. I got a green light here. It says we're live here, and so I can only assume that what I think is a live production is now 30 seconds old. My cohort got tired of waiting and bailed. She was like right here, and she got tired of looking at me funny and bailed. So got her per diem uh, right there for wherever she's standing. What we're looking at tonight is a three three pines that I brought in from the balcony. Today we've been having just some really blustery. It was like a real blustery kind of day. We got quite windy, not strong wind, but just constantly blowing quite a bit. And it's your basic spring stuff. Um, this is a Japanese black pine, 17 years from seed. It has a little bit of clover on it. We're going to try to take care of that a little. This is by comparison, a baby Japanese black pine. It's in a terracotta pot. It is. It's in a terracotta pot. We wired it. We did some styling to it. We're doing some exposed root work to it, but it is also uh, came down with the serious case of the clovers, and we might reduce some of the needle, clean up some of the needles down here on the bottom, and then that takes us to the trio, the third tree, and this is also the one that has the most clover on it. This is a ponderosa pine. It's also a Yamadori ponderosa, Yamadori ponderosa, and it has started pushing out new growth at the end of the year last year, kind of out of season. Sometimes I'm told they'll do that when they have an abundance of energy, and a lot of times where they come from, that push out of new growth may or may not survive. Here, it tends to survive, so I still have to worry about that using too much energy. Instead of the tree having a proper dormancy, we put out a whole another flush of needles. Otherwise, there is quite a bit to that part that plays right in to what it is what we want to do. Um, so with two of these trees being Japanese black pine, that's a multi flush pine. This one being a ponderosa, that's a single flush pine, and that means different things to different people depending on what your game is. If your game is to let a tree grow out in the yard or in a nursery container or something like that for a few years, then neither one of those things is something that you necessarily have to pay attention to, right off the bat. But at some point, if you are into a certain design aesthetics, or if you're into developing the trees, you may want to start considering what and when and how much. Um, like for instance, before these guys go back out tonight, they will all get a replenished supply of biogold. We're entering into spring here. This trees has just started showing signs of candles. This tree has already started showing new growth associated with spring and candle growth. So in a while, around April, we will stop feeding these trees. So our window for how much food they can take in is between now and April. Because in April, we're going to take up all our biogold on our Japanese black pines that we're cutting candles on. And the reason we'll do that is because, well, the one in the terracotta pot won't necessarily get that treatment because it's in a terracotta pot. It's over potted so that it can produce a lot of roots, so it can develop a lot of other stuff that we're doing there. But if it were having its roots restricted, then the idea is that in spring, at some point in spring, we stop feeding it so that whatever nutrients are in the tree can start working their way back out of abundance to kind of a more neutral state. Then we go back through and we cut all those new candles off. And however late in candle season we wait to cut off those candles, we're giving ourselves more or less time for our second flush, which is why they call them two flush, multi flush trees, which gives us more or less time for our second flush to grow. Now, the reason we cut candles on multi flush trees is several things. Cutting the candles at a certain time of spring when it's candle cutting season, either at the beginning or at the middle or at the end of it, will dictate the needle size. So if it's an exceptionally large bonsai tree, an imperial bonsai tree, you might wait uh, just starting into the beginning of candle season and you go back through and you cut off every one of those candles. And then it will immediately start making a second flush, and that second flush will be a little shorter, but towards the big end. Otherwise, it would do something like that. So if you have a medium-sized tree, then you're going to wait until the middle of candle cutting season. You go through and you cut all the candles, and then the tree sets out to start making the second flush of needles, and the needle length will be dictated by how much time it has left. And because you've already stopped feeding it 30 days ago, it doesn't have an abundance of nutrients to just make a super long needle the second time around. So it says, yeah, you cut my needles this time around. You have to take what you get. They're not going to be they're not going to be as long. So one of the benefits to candle cutting is we get to dictate what the needle length is, and we can and that's important so that we can keep needle length in proportion to the size of the tree. So the other thing, people, this is another big benefit to this. Quite often, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Back buds. When you go through and you cut off um, you cut off a candle, it'll turn around and just go poof all the way around where that candle got cut, and you might see three, four, you know, high numbers. You might see just a whole bunch of buds jump up from the spot where you just cut that one. So when you're developing a tree, you're making buds for yourself. You're making choices for yourself by doing that. And that is why we cut candles in the spring on multi-flush pines. Multi-flush pines like Japanese black pines, Japanese red pines, uh, and I've heard of a few others that will consistently regenerate a second flush of growth. Why would trees? Why would certain species of pine trees regenerate a second flush of growth? Why would they allow us to cut all the new growth off and then have them just turn around and do it again? In the case of the red pine and the black pine, those species of pine developed in regions where high winds, high enough to possibly strip a tree bare, is possible. In places where you see high incidents of fire go through, you'll see that trees will do things uh, to fortify their bark to save them in the event they have all their limbs burned off. Well, in places where you can see trees that could be exposed to hurricane or gale winds, then they will have adapted in such a way that they could be stripped bare and replenish their foliation foliation. And that's just kind of hi Paul, how are you? And that's just kind of an adaptation they've done to facilitate life in that environment. And when I first heard about that, I thought, wow, that's probably some deep. Oh, by the way, how is the sound? Let me know. I don't get playback. I just get little balls that light up or go off depending on how loud or quiet I am. And I'm going with a mic that's giving me a green light, but I'm not really hearing me on playback. So we're guessing all's good. Um, so when I first heard about multi-flush pines and the different techniques for dealing with them versus single flush pines, it just very much reminded me of the mystique of bonsai and how some of these things have been uh, dating back for these practices will have been dating. It seemed like bonsai customs and all that will have been dating back for so long. But in this case, it this particular practice doesn't go back that far. As I understand it, somebody in a very well-known family in bonsai, the Boone family, part of the Boone clan, uh, once observed that a beetle had just totally gone to town and wiped out a bud. And they further noticed that the tree promptly put out a cluster more. And that was really the first time that anybody made mention of that as a technique. It's not a practice that I think is thousands of years old, the way I would have originally have guessed, and it's just kind of funny. Other things, I think now in a lot of ways, our ideas about how to maintain bonsai trees are way more reverent towards the tree. It There's a way to make a tree be healthy and thrive and respond in the way we want it to in bonsai. And in the past, or too many times, I don't know whether it's always been that way. Maybe there are always been people who were conscientious and knew other ways, but maybe we don't hear as much about them because sometimes the most knowledgeable people don't share what they know. Uh, it goes their teachings kind of what could be their teachings kind of go with them. Um, Good, 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 good. But I always assumed what we used to hear is that there were people back in Japan who would know exactly how long they could go without watering a tree, just how long in between time they could, and the idea wasn't to water it as soon as possible. The idea was more to wait as late as possible. It was the holding back of water. It was the holding back of this and that. And that little balance between life and death, uh, it's no wonder that people would think that way because you can see nature works that way. You know, when we go in nature and we find a tree that is uh, that is very small, despite its years, it's had one foot in the grave all this time. That's a relative statement. Maybe it's not really had one foot in the grave, but when it comes to being in an energy positive state, it never was. So years later, 20 years later, it has bark on its trunk, a sign of 10 years. It has bark on its limbs, another 5 or 10 years. And it's still a tiny tree. So that would be a tree that nature will have stunted, that nature will have bonsaied on its own, a Yamadori. And it's no wonder that people would bring these trees back, especially if they live in the environment where it originally lived and continue to starve it of light, continue to starve it of nutrients, continue to starve it of all this other stuff because they think they've got this tree that's just so small because it's had such a hard time. And on the other hand, maybe the needles are small too, right? So, and they think, what wonderful luck. The needles are so small on this tree, which normally has huge needles, but this one is stunted in its growth and its needles. It must be some weird hybrid. And the minute you start feeding it, then all of a sudden the needles get humongous. And you think, oh, whoa, whoa, stop doing that. Don't do that again. You know, well, that's how you make the tree healthy. And it doesn't mean that it's going to overgrow its container if you give it a fair shake for the first time in its life. So yeah, we start this is the time to make sure that your black pines, if you're planning on if you're planning on decandling your pines this year, or you're thinking that this is the year that you're going to learn about that kind of stuff, you can still fall right in the game while you learn if you make sure that whatever your feeding regimen is, you're doing it you're doing it in early spring because it's about time to close that door when we start getting a little closer to April. If you're looking to do candles on a black pine, uh, when you start cutting those candles, it will have been good timing to have not fed the tree for 30 days before that. That's in effect what I'm saying. Uh, if you're not feeding your tree right now, the time when you can no longer feed it will be here before you know it. So, and at that point, if you're, cutting your candles and you're reducing the needles on a Japanese black pine or a red pine, and you've went through and picked up all the like bio gold, or maybe those little you've got little fertilizer and little tea bags or something, and you went through and picked all that up. So now that it's run that out, we have to wait until the needles harden off. We have to wait until that second flush of needles comes out and hardens off before we can resume feeding again. We have to basically wait until fall before we can resume feeding again. So it's a long, it's like if you don't feed it when you get that opportunity, that next opportunity is going to be a minute. So that's why that's important. That's why right now is important when it comes to doing all of that. Oh yeah, just drug out a lot of gravel. Totally missed clover. This little chunk of clover is like a tooth extraction. Get out of there. Didn't even look like all that when said and done. Okay. A root canal. Just did a little root canal. Okay. Now, what I'm pulling weeds on is my ponderosa. This is a collected Yamadori, collected in Deadwood, South Dakota, elevation 5,500 feet up. It is the Yamadori. It is a literal. It is a Yamadori. It is, like I said, a ponderosa. Got a little deadwood feature over here. I pruned it back. It was wide, wide, wide. This is the trough when I call my coffee cup. A little inside line. Last week when I was doing my video, fired up the video, fired up the music, slid open the patio door, said hi to Frida, showed her her dog treat, walked outside on the patio, started doing trees, glanced over while I was showing a tree, and Frida had her paws up on the coffee table that you can't see. It's just right here where I just sat. This cup had her paws up on this table, had her head down, and was going to town on my coffee and Dutch chocolate milk. So yeah, and she's like, she's busy. She won't care if I have some of her espresso. So yeah, you can see her doing that. You can actually, I kind of looked up like, what the hell? But it was kind of hard to see because you would had to have seen her through a chair, but I could see. That's something for y'all to look through. I tell you what, we'll decide a price. Go back through our videos and find the one where you can see where you can see Frida. If you look through a wrought iron chair that you can see through, you will see Frida in there with her paws up on the patio on the coffee table, head down, facing my coffee cup, going to town, and you'll win. And we'll decide what at some point. Probably depends on where you live. So this is my Japanese black pine. Y'all know this guy. This is a 17. Well, when I got it, it was a 17-year from seed. I've had it 2 or 3 years now. I've repotted it. I repotted it a year or so ago. I think I got that right. I figured out that straight boon mix was a little much for me. So sometimes I'm hard headed. I'm like, if you think something's better, but you have a hard time getting used to it, or you have a hard time using it correctly, like deal with it. Just get the good stuff, just deal with it, you know. And whereas I kind of do uh think of akadama as the good stuff because I had somebody explain to me its benefits. Now, I've had a lot of people tell me that they've, get nowhere with akadama. I've- and I think maybe it depends. It depends on a lot of stuff. Depends on who's using it. It depends on where you live. It depends on what it is you're dealing with where you live, and how your substrate reacts to those things I just mentioned. But what akadama is, sup- uh, its benefits are is that if you were to look at it up close, you would see that it has little holes in it like lava rock. But then if you were to take a magnifying glass and look at it, you would see little holes that were too small for you to see without the magnifying glass. And then if you were to turn around and get a bigger magnifying glass that was more powerful, you would see that there was smaller holes that had this kind of Swiss cheese or slash lava rock look to it. And all the way down, just keep going right on down. There's going to be smaller and smaller and smaller little holes. And and because it's like little, not like, because it is little lumps of clay, when you water, the water goes right through it. But then because it's clay, each little lump of clay, unlike a silicone rock, each little lump of clay will soak up that water so that it changes colors. You can tell it's wet in color, but the soil still will not be as wet as if it were potting soil. And every one of those little holes, the tiny and the bigger ones. Hey, Steve. Yeah, this is my rip off the Saturday Night Live. Not quite a Lorne Michaels production here, but yeah. Um, but every one of those tiny little holes in the clay, as the soil begins to dry out, very fine roots will go racing around looking to collect those any water that's still held behind. And tiny, tiny, tiny little roots, before they're even big enough to see, will start finding themselves like capillaries down those little finding those little holes that have little water pockets in them. And as they go in those, they grow. And as they grow, they bust those holes loose, breaking down that little piece of akadama. And then they break down a bigger piece and a bigger hole and a bigger hole. And all the while, that akadama is encouraging that tree to make finer and finer roots to find finer little holes with which to capture the resources of water that are in those little holes within the akadama. And that's kind of what it does. I found for me that it caused me to overwater my uh, Japanese black pines when I first started growing them. Also, I had a moment a couple of years ago where I figured out, like, this is a perfect time to go into this. How many black pines, how many black pines would you have to repot before you could look at a tree 2 or 3 days after you watered it and picture what the substrate looks like deep in the center. One of the first times I ever saw somebody repot a Japanese black pine, it was a California local, but the video was quite old. I found myself going, wow, that at the time I was going, wow, that video is 12 years old. I wonder why the guy stopped making videos 12 years ago. But he had gotten from the club a free little Japanese black pine. That happens a lot. People will make seedlings like we did, and then bring them to the club, and everybody gets to go home with one. So he had one, and it was in a little plastic bonsai pot, and he was going to talk about how to um, how to repot a Japanese black pine, giving really good advice, but just with this, what he thought at the time seemed like maybe it was kind of a laughably small Japanese black pine. I was shocked. He broke the wire loose from a pot that was this big. The pine tree was that big, and it was a little. And when he undid the wire and pulled that tree out of the pot, to see those roots, they look like an old Brillo pad or an SOS pad or something. Not only were they bone dry, but they were so woody. I would have thought they were dead just looking at them. And so, and you know, that's that's what they're actually supposed to look like. So you think about other trees being happy and lush growing environment, and uh, to make them lush above, a lot of times it's cool lush if they're lush below. So uh, not so. You need these guys need to dry out a little bit. One of the people that I learned from likes to grow their pines in just pure akadama. It's pretty. It says bonsai and it says manicured and well maintained. Even if you don't grow in that, I know a lot of people who will use whatever size akadama, whatever size granules uh, look best for the size of the tree, and they'll top dress it, even if they use something else. Right? They'll top dress it with akadama. Use boon mix, but then top dress it with some. So anyway, that's kind of why it's kind of why people use akadama, and also, but whenever I use it, I find that the trees that I have, if they're in pure akadama, it's hard for me to balance their water. It's hard for me to not overwater, and it's hard for me to visualize what that root mass looks like down in here. People will tell you to scrape the soil back an inch or so and see how far down you have to go before it gets dark looking, where it's still holding moisture. But what does it look like here? Are you always watering it before this ever has a chance to dry out? Is this little bit right in here, you wait until you finally don't see water from going back just that much, and as soon as you don't see water going back that much, you water it again. In my case, that probably meant that it never really dried out in here, and the tree would want that. So one year, somebody whose videos, I'm always watching videos, good videos, bad videos, I'll watch them so you won't have to. Suggested the skewer system, the dipstick method. I call it the skewer system. They don't. Not everybody goes on and on about weenie skewers the way I do, but so that's basically it. You can walk back to this tree 30 minutes later and pull this out, and this little guy of wood here will tell you how wet or dry. At some point, it will lie to you a little because when the tree starts to go really dry, the stick will soak up uh, the last of the water. So the tree might be drier than what the stick shows. But on the whole, if you do that, and just kind of like checking the dipstick on the motor of a car or something, I would leave them. I would leave them in the pot and walk up and pull the dipstick and see how we were doing. And a couple of weeks of doing that, and I knew what it was going to say before I pulled it. At that point, I didn't need it. I had gotten, you know, and that's 10 minutes ago. I started this conversation with how many Japanese black pines would you have to repot before you knew what the soil or the substrate looked like way down here deep in the, you know, to look at a tree and think, well, I haven't watered that in 2.5 days. It's been 80 something degrees. Yesterday was a bit of a scorcher before it ended. So I bet this looks like, and be right because you're, you know, have experience and are knowledgeable. How many trees would you have to repot to get that general feel for what the top of the soil looks like to how that equates farther down? I think it would be a lot. I think it would be an awful lot of trees. You know, the guys that have bonsai gardens, they'll go through that amount while they're baby apprentices somewhere, right? It won't take them very long to see that many trees if you're an apprentice. But for the rest of us who have, you know, a pine or two, how many years would it take me to get a good general feel for what the substrate looks like underneath the top? Even if I'm rubbing, you know, like when they tell you, rub it down about an inch or so, and then if it's dark, check it again tomorrow. That still doesn't tell me what it's like way down there, and more so if it's a bigger pot. So if you're always wanting to be there, be handy, standing there waiting for its time to water your tree, then over time you're just, it's gonna always maybe get a little too much water, and oaks will take that plus some. Pine trees would rather not. That part where their roots are woody, you can rot them. So uh, I think in that case, when I went with the dipstick method, when I started using, I'm just gonna rake all this off because it's gonna go everywhere anyway. But I need to get down here and get these clovers out. That little system right there, within a month, uh, gave me a good feel for what was going on below the surface. Like I said, after a month of walking up, you know, walking up to a tree, seeing this stick sticking out of its pot, and pulling the stick out and looking and seeing what the moisture level was, it didn't take a month before I started anticipating what it would say ahead of a time. And by the time a month was up, I was always right what it was going. I already knew what it was going to say before I looked at it, and that is that insight, and that helped. That helped a lot. See, that doesn't tell you everything. That tells you how much water is in there. What we know from pines, if you're watering, if you've got like oaks, You've got like wisterias, you've got like bald cypress, you've got dawn redwood. They like to have their feet wet. You've got trident maple. If it's past 60 degrees, you're running through there with water every day until you see it pour out of the bottom. If you do that, you keep your tree. If for some reason you have a problem doing that or you think you can skimp on that, at some point or another that'll probably catch you out. But as long as you always do that, those trees will always thank you much. These guys, you do have to kind of figure it out and you do have to time it or you can hurt them. So that went, you know, and what they tell you when you're going in is don't overwater 'em. All right. You don't know what that very broad statement means. What is overwater? If I water it this year, have I overwatered it? If I water it today and then water it uh, again tomorrow, is that overwatered? Um, there's no right answer to that. All there is first get a feel for what it looks like inside there after you haven't watered for a day. Get a feel for what it looks like inside there if you haven't watered for 2 days or 3 days or 4 days, right? Then get a feel for how that makes the tree respond. When I had one tree, when I had one pine, and I didn't want to get overwhelmed by something that intimidated me. So, so what I do, I did one pine. Okay, I would go out there and look at that pine. How are you doing, pine? Are you okay? Do you have everything you need? I don't know jack squat. You're gonna have to tell me what you need. Oh my God, you look yellow. Do you need water? Is that too much water? Have I not been watering you enough? Is it bugs? Do we need to have a talk? I mean, there are all these. You live and die by the health of that one tree. But if you do like what I ended up doing a little later and getting 10 trees, then if one of them starts to look a little yellow, you look at the other nine and you go, hey, your nine counterparts all look fine except for you. What is it? You don't take that as personally as you would have if that had been the one tree you were trying to grow and it turned yellow on you. Also, you go through and you water all your trees and they look pretty good. Let's take one of them and water it every other time for a day or two and see whether it looks more or less green. And then, depending on how that tree does, you can respond to the rest and see how they take to that same thing. In this way, you begin to equate what a little and a lot of water is after you've already learned to equate what it looks like in the pot when you haven't watered after 1 day, after 2 days, after 5 days, etc. So you have to know what it is that you don't know, and then you have to know how that affects you. Boom. Once you've got that bit covered, and basically taking it down into a system like that, and thinking about it in those terms, covers a lot. That takes little pine trees, for instance, into something that you just get and kill to something that you live to fight another day. The way I always say about my oaks and cypress, because you could just go out and water those every day. You may not know how to ramify them, you may not know how to develop them or something, but they'll live long enough for you to figure that out. And when you balance that water and oxygen thing, the way pines are going to really ask you to do, um, that all part gets a lot easier. Gets an awful, awful lot easier. So those of you who plan on doing candle reduction uh, on your multi-flush pines, you guys should all be making sure that everything's getting fed now, while before you have to pull all that, before you have to pull all that up a little later on in spring. And then, so that leaves, like, for instance, that ponderosa there. That's not the same method we would use. Ponderosas are known. for extremely long needles. Some people thought that they were a less desirable bonsai species because of their needle length. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think they've caught on in a big way. The United States is one of the few bonsai, not one of the few, but there are places for which Yamadoris hardly exist anymore. I mean, if you go up into the mountains to look for wild trees, you might find something that sprouted 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and we get to call that Yamadori. But a lot of the great Yamadori has already come from Japan. They've already mined their mountains of that gold, and a long time ago, right? In the United States, um, we still have a lot, and our deal is different. One, as the hobby grows, more and more people will collect, and uh, also our climate conditions are such these days where we're probably, that's going to reflect some of our losses. So that's got that. But when it comes to, we talked about why we cut candles on multi-flush pines. How that gives us the basis for dictating how long the needle growth will be. And we're also able to increase our bud count. Might not be something that's really important if you've already got a very well developed tree. But in the early going, that's how we get this to turn into 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. We go back through after that, and where it has made a cluster of buds after we've cut the candles, and we will maybe there's 6 new little baby buds there, and we will pick two that are horizontally opposed one another, or like this, or we'll pick two that are like this that we can wire like this, and we'll cut the rest. Sometimes we'll cut the biggest ones, uh, leaving the bottom two. Sometimes we'll save the biggest ones because they match one another really well. What you would probably like to do, and all things being equal, is pick the smallest two buds, and if you've got a pair that are in equal strength and are close together like this, that's great. If you've got one here like this that's perfect size, but the other one is right here like that, then uh, cut all the rest and leave that. You can still fix that with wire, leaving two. So that's the closeout on that. Let's say we wanted the needles to get smaller on this guy. What we would do, I don't think. What we would do to get shorter needles on a ponderosa pine, we don't go through and reduce the candles. We don't go through and select buds. We don't go through and thin the needles. Um, in ponderosas are single flush. They don't have a season as such. The needles that come out grow until they die. They just keep getting longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. Also, the vascular tissue on these needles is a lot coarser than the vascular tissue, the waxy texture of these guys. These guys, through the vascular tissue that's on the black pine, they pass oxygen and water. They pass water through the oxygen more readily. These guys seal it up. They can actually even close up their pores and hang on to what water they have. They can even close off their roots when they suspect that they're not going to be taking in any more water, but they're worried that the water might start trying to take water out of them. I mean, that the dirt might try to leach water out of them. They'll close off their pores, and then that long root that it's got growing down the crack of a rock or something. That'll be what it lives off of until all of that's gone. Then it'll kill that off and start trying to establish another one. I mean, ponderosas really have to be crafty in the wild and some of the ways that they survive. And when people talk about these things, they say, what is it about their environment that they thrive in? South facing cliffs, um, high elevation, enormous amounts of cold, short season, scorching hot sun at high elevation, the same tree that'll be covered in snow for way longer than most trees have a growing season. That same tree will turn right around and get scorching hot summer heat, but for only a few months, a very, very short season. So we think that ponderosas, like all that stuff. That's not necessarily true to say that it likes all that stuff. What would be true to say is, out of all of that stuff, Ponderosa can do that, can play that little trick better than its competitors. So that environment that is that not conducive to other life is the place where a Ponderosa can call its own without somebody else coming along and trying to weed it out. It can exist in those harsh environments better than its competitors, and that is how it is adapted. So if you turn around and feed it, it will thrive. If you turn around and water it a little more, you can overwater these way faster than you can overwater a Japanese excuse me a Japanese black pine, and that's for that vascular tissue in the needles thing that we were talking about. Their ability to hold water and stuff means that you just don't water these guys as much. The roots are coarse roots. These trees take well to being grafted with other species because when you want to graft one tree to another, what you would like to do is graft a fine vascular tree to a coarse vascular tree. If you go that way, you've got something that the base of the tree can sustain what you're growing on it. And when it comes to that little conversation, they just about do not come any coarser than Ponderosa. So by putting a Japanese black pine on Ponderosa, you can then take this tree to Florida. You can take this tree to LA. You can take this tree to Oakland, where it's debatable as to whether or not I can have this tree here in Alameda or this close to Oakland, because it is a succulum. So that's how one way you could get short needles, and one way you could get around your growing environment would be that. However, what we want to do if we want to get shorter needles on a ponderosa pine is we feed it. We feed it and we up its watering. We give it as much of everything that it could ever want. And what the tree will do then is it will respond to that by producing more back buds, and the needles will be longer. And instead of going through and cutting any of that, we don't. We continue to feed the tree. And it takes all of that energy that it made from having those new back buds and those longer needles, and it doubles down. It back buds even more. And by the time all of those buds come out, all of a sudden you've got a tree in a confined pot that has produced 2, 3 times the needle count that it had just a little while ago. Those needles are longer than they were in years past. Now that it's getting fed, now that it's getting watered, it's got all this stuff. It looks a far cry from what our end objective is to make shorter needles. But because we have more needles and because they're longer and because it's still in a shallow pot, the amount of energy allocated to each needle is begin to go down. And as this goes down, the tree's natural response to this will be shorter needles. It's going, hey, you gave me all this food. We made all these needles. They got so long. We had extra energy. So we made even more needles. But now we can't keep growing those as long because we only have so much room for roots in this tiny little pot. So from now on, they're going to have to be shorter. Okay. I hope you're not mad. And that just plays right in. That just plays right into our evil hands. We have done nothing but give this tree everything. And what it did in return is gave us exactly what we wanted in return, shorter needles. So you wait till the following season when it comes time to prune, and you can go through and clear back some of those limbs that it put out that were unwanted. You can harvest some of that energy that it's been putting on and patting on and patting on, but we still have that short needle, and we can count on those short needles for a few years, and then when we see that starting to get long again, we can repeat that process. And that is how you get shorter needles on a ponderosa pine. And that is how you get shorter needles on a Japanese black pine. And as promised, all three of these trees have just gotten weeded, and this one doesn't need any cleanup. This one doesn't need any cleanup. This one, I could clean up some. But as promised, before they go back out, um, they'll all get fed. We're being fed. Sometimes when I bring stuff in, the little pellets fly off, but also there's plenty of them breaking down there. And in this one, it's got plenty of biogold in there, but it's all breaking down. It's just now time to replenish that because the tree is it's kind of switching back on. That's also I noticed after I started using that, that was when the amount of mycorrhiza I saw in the pots went up quite a bit. Um, so that was pretty good. I was glad the way that turned out. All right, that was an hour. We're gonna stop it here. I cleaned up a little bit of the bottom growth there. Not a whole lot. I could probably clean up some of these spots, but we don't have to yet. We're gonna let these guys be more spring like. Like and subscribe. If you guys have not already, our next spot tomorrow is Sunday. We'll probably go out and either shoot sunny, beautiful California weather, or we'll shoot some rainy, blustery, windy, blowing sideways kind of stuff like we've been looking at here lately. We're propagating some new Japanese black pine seed, so 32 of those. In a couple of days, we'll break out the tweezers and start putting those in little things. So we've got a lot of little pines we're making, and we're learning. We're learning all this stuff. And I appreciate you, and Frida appreciates you, and uh, thank thank you so much for watching. Yes, I hit the button, then it goes end.